If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, have you ever seen anything you couldn't easily or rationally explain? UFOs, ghosts, etc. All of these stories happened in my grandparents' house on my dad's side of the family. I believe the house was built in the late 1800s. Also, I'm really bad with names, and I don't remember who all was involved except for my parents/grandparents, so most of the names here are made up. There was a family gathering at my grandparents' house and mostly everyone was in the living room on the main floor. My mom had gone upstairs to go to the bathroom, and when she came down she started talking to my grandpa. I didn't know Aunt Susie was here. I thought she was staying home. My grandpa looked at her kind of weird and told her that she was, in fact, not here. My mom told him that she was, and she had just had a conversation with her. Just as soon as she finished telling him, the phone rang and my grandma picked it up. "It's Paul, Susie died." This happened on another day. I think it might have been just my parents and my grandparents in the living room. This is really difficult to explain without knowing what the house looks like, so I've drawn up a beautiful outline of the layout. On the front door, unused one, there are some bells. I don't know what their purpose is, probably just decoration. There's also a rubber thing under the front door that stops all air from coming in or going out. There are large bushes in front of the door. Nobody uses this door. Sometime during the day, my parents and grandparents are just chatting in the living room, when they hear the back door open and close. This isn't unusual as they live on a farm and have people drop by to buy eggs or whatever. They called to whoever came in to let them know they were in the living room. No answer, but the tea kettle did whistle. There wasn't any tea in it, it was just sitting on the stove. Then the sound of moving chairs came from the dining room. It's kind of cluttered, you have to push a lot of crap out of the way to get through. And then a few moments later the bells on the front door jungled, visible from where they were sitting, and a draft of cold air swept through the living room. My dad and grandpa got up and checked, but nobody was in the house. They must have had a visitor. Me and a few buddies used to hang out in a trailer in a friend's backyard. We used to hear little girls screaming bloody murder. The only problem was, to our knowledge, there was no little girls on the block. We thought it was ghosts. We actually left the trailer that night. Then they caught Creepy Phil about a year later. We have come to the conclusion that the screams were not ghosts. It was the little girls being beaten or whatever he did. He lived across the street. We had a TV that would turn on by itself in the middle of the night. It was in our guest room, and we rarely went in there. It would be showing channels that none of us, nor our guests, would ever watch, like religious stations. One night, after having turned on by itself, we moved it to the basement and left it unplugged. Bear in mind that this move took place around 5 years ago, and the TV has remained unplugged since then. A month ago, when I was home alone late at night, I heard talking coming from the basement and I went down to investigate. The TV, still unplugged, was on and I turned it off, then proceeded to freak the fuck out. When my parents got home, they asked me why the TV in the basement was on. I told them it had been on but I turned it off, but they claimed that it was still on. We all just kind of stood there, and my dad finally said that he was getting rid of the TV. I still have no idea how it could have turned on twice after having been unplugged for 5 years. Creeps me out. I was probably around 5 years old, and I was in my grandparents' house for the Thanksgiving holiday. The entire family was there. Anyway, my grandparents had a toy closet with leftover toys that my mom and her siblings used to play with. I was playing with an old doll, one with a pull string in its back that talked. I was pretending to give it a bath, and I would talk to the doll and pull the string to hear its response. My uncle, Chris, was standing in the doorway, watching me play and talking about something or other. I removed the doll from its pretend bath and said, "Okay, it's time for bed now." I pulled the string, and the doll said, "But I'm not dry yet." I remember being confused and stunned. Chris stopped talking and looked at me and said, "Did you say that?" When I shook my head, he repeated, "I've never heard the doll say that before." I never played with it again. From my grandpa's memoir. There was an incident during my time stationed in Guam back in the 60s I'm unable to explain very well. One day we got a call from a farmer, claiming that something fell from the sky and landed on his farm. We knew no US satellites had gone down, so it was most likely Russian. We get out there and discover this small object. It was about the size of a baseball, completely clear, and on one side of it, it had a waffle-like imprint on it as if it were attached to a grid. Physically, it felt like glass. We didn't know what to do with it, and one of our officers was an astronomer, so we presented to him. He kept it as a paperweight. One day while speaking with him, I had accidentally knocked the object off his desk. It looked like it was cracked and about to shatter into pieces. After 5 minutes or so, the object was clear again. All of the cracks were gone. We struck it a few times again just to watch the shattered object fix itself. I ended up telling my buddies about it, and they wouldn't believe me. When the officer was off base one day, we snuck into his quarters and took the object. Everyone then proceeded to try and break it, but it would keep fixing itself. We stopped doing this when someone had thrown it so hard it bounced off the cement and dented one of our fighter jets. Word about the object spread quickly. The local-based newspaper even did a story on our incident, after the officer reluctantly allowed it. Days later, some men purporting to be from the Weapons Bureau showed up on base. Not only did they confiscate the object, but they tore through our quarters in order to find every issue of the newspaper which was printed. After that, we were told everything we had seen and read was classified. To this day, I'm still unable to explain the object's unique properties. Using a Ouija board with a friend, knowing full well I wasn't moving the pointer, and completely convinced that she wasn't either, I decided that one of us had to be moving the pointer, perhaps subconsciously. The best way to test this, I decided, was to ask the board something neither of us knew or could know, but could easily verify after the fact. We were doing this during lunch, at high school. We both had the same class next, physical science, so we decided to ask the board if our teacher was married. The board said yes. Neither of us knew that, but I suppose either/both of us could have guessed it. We also asked the board when he was married. The board said 35. We probably could have guessed that too, I suppose, in hindsight, but it seemed a valid enough test at the time. I should note that when I said earlier I was convinced she wasn't moving the pointer, this wasn't entirely because I believed her. I did, but still, I wanted to be sure. And so, while the pointer was moving particularly quick one time, I lifted my fingers off the pointer, ever so slightly. The fact I had raised my fingers should have been imperceptible to her, at the very least, until she had already continued sliding the pointer out from under my raised fingers. But, no. That did not happen. Instead, the very instant my fingers lost contact with the pointer, it stopped as if it had been glued to the board. I mean, there was just no delay. I cannot emphasize this enough. It just halted. There's no way she could have possibly reacted that quickly. That's how I decided she was most certainly not moving the pointer, and how I decided that even though I didn't think I was, maybe I really had been, subconsciously. And so, the questions. Shortly thereafter, we asked our teacher if he was married. He was. We asked when. He thought about it, joked his wife would be upset if she saw him pause like this, and then assuredly replied, yeah, it was definitely when he was 35. When my sister was a little tyke just learning how to talk, my parents were going through old family photos from back in the day. They stopped on a picture of my deceased great aunt, to which my sister pointed I passed her on my way to being born. This kind of freaked Mom out a bit, and asked her to clarify. She again said the same, and specified what she was wearing when she saw her. She very accurately described an old dress and hat she used to wear all the time. When I was a child I used to have the strangest dreams. I would find myself in a sun-drenched field playing ball with a 6-year-old African girl, her hair in twists, clad in red and white checked gingham romper. Eventually, her dad, an enormous dusty farmer equipped with pitchfork and leading a horse, would call her home. She would wave goodbye and I would seize awake. I had this dream several times, each time similar, with the difference being the game we played. Perhaps ball, perhaps hunting for insects, or simply lazing around in the grass. I knew her name was Sarah. I knew her family worked the land. Somehow, I knew the land. Then one night I had a lucid dream. I was in my bed asleep, and though it was the middle of the night, light streamed in as if it were noon. Sarah was by my bed, tugging my nightgown sleeve. She pleaded with me to get up, to play with her. So I sluggishly rose from my bed and followed her out my room and to the foot of the stairs leading to the spooky 3rd floor. I was suddenly leaden with dread, a feeling akin to seeing that particular look in my mother's eye before she told my great-grandmother had died. Sarah whirled around, eyes inquisitive, her playful demands to come upstairs. To play. Honed by something sinister. Her father appeared at the top of the stairwell, horse and all I could think, this is ridiculous. How could a horse go up all those stairs? I told her I could not, would not come up and play, and she looked at me so sadly. The saddest oldest sad I had ever seen. I woke up that morning, asleep at the foot of the stairs, filled with the deepest sadness I had ever felt. I never had the dream again. However, shortly thereafter, the gardeners unearthed an old hitching post in the backyard. Many years later, I went for a hike across my street in search of an apocryphal graveyard, oldest freed black cemetery in the north. I waded through the smallish swamp in my neighbor's yard, and trudged up the hill to the area I had seen marked on an ancient map. There was the cemetery, invisible from the road, with 15 or so headstones. While many were impossible to read, and others fallen and broken, one stood out. Its memorial tree had grown around it, encasing the stone in tree, shielding it from the elements. The body beneath was named Sarah. She had died at the age of 7, and had inhabited whatever structure existed where my house now stands. Not necessarily something I've seen, but rather something I can't explain. When I was really young, from ages 2 to about 4, I used to tell stories to my parents about when I lived before. I would always begin my stories with that phrase, and the stories would be elaborate tales about my experiences in a past life, usually set during the Middle Ages, or 1800s. What really freaked my parents out was that these tales weren't the typical fantasy stories of a child with an active imagination. Instead, they were stories of everyday life during that time period. My parents tried to rationalize my tales and figure out where I had picked up the information about those time periods. They never could figure out where I got the information from, and one day the stories just stopped. I live about 25 minutes out from the nearest suburb town in my area. The route is mostly through houses and small housing developments for half the trip, and mostly through small farms for the second half. There is this cell phone, or radio? Something, tower about 1/3 of the way to my house, and it's opposite a large horse farm. This entire particular area is flat and clear, and the drive through it is about 50 to 60 seconds long. On 2 occasions, I have been driving through at night, and witnessed something flying overhead. Now, I'm not one of those UFO/alien conspiracy or believer types. But this flying thing really creeped me out the first time. I was driving a friend of mine back to my house, at about 10 p.m., and we both saw this thing flying overhead. It had lights in the shape of an airplane, mostly. It seemed like they were better placed to suit something round, than something plane-shaped. It was sitting perfectly still, maybe 500 feet overhead. We saw it before reaching the clearing, through the break in the trees where the road is. This thing was just floating there for about 30 seconds, and by the time we hit the clearing, it started drifting sideways. I slowed down to get a better look, and rolled my windows down to hear, but it was completely silent. Before we left the clearing, this thing started floating almost straight up at a ridiculous angle for an airplane, maybe an 80-degree angle. After that, we had gone too far to get a clear line of sight to it. My friend suggested it could be a blimp, but I think it would have to be a pretty small one, about the size of a light airplane. Second time, I was driving my brother in town to meet my parents for dinner, at about 8 o'clock. This one was very recent, so it was already pitch black dark outside. Exact same place, we see this thing flying again. This time it is much lower. If I have any sense of vertical depth perception, I would place it maybe 100 feet over our heads. I completely stopped in the middle of the road this time. There were no other cars around, kind of odd around here to see no one on the roads, but it happens. My brother and I both leaned out our windows to try to get a better look, but we couldn't make out what this thing was. Again, it was completely silent, and just floating there almost directly over our heads. It started moving in a straight line, keeping the same altitude, and roughly along the road, so I decided to follow it. After about half a minute of following, it changed direction instantly and started flying to the left, away from us, where there was no road for us to follow it on. It quickly went out of line of sight behind some trees, and we just turned around and headed back to dinner. I've had several repeat occurrences of a shadowy, blacker than black, for lack of a better description, looking spider creature. It's usually about the size of a basketball and has over-exaggerated legs. My first run-in with it was when I was living in Portland, Oregon. I had been talking to a friend of mine on the phone with the lights out when all of a sudden it felt like there was something just staring at me. I looked down at the floor, and even though the lights were out, I could see this weird, very dark shape with legs. Even though I couldn't see a face or eyes, I could just feel it staring at me. Freaked me out, and when I turned on the lights there was nothing. For several years after that I would occasionally wake up and have this shadow spider hovering next to me. This happened even after I moved to Chicago in different addresses. During my 7 years there I would wake to this spider creature just staring at me. At the start it bothered me, but after happening so often I just got used to it. During this time period I was living with my girlfriend, wife now, but never mentioned it to her since I thought it was just my imagination. About 2 years ago we moved back to Portland, and the first time in a long time the creature freaked me out. I woke up because I felt some pressure on my chest, and when I opened my eyes I saw the spider on my chest staring at me. I gasped and thrust myself up, which caused it to just poof away. My wife asked me what was wrong since I woke her up with my loud gasp. I explained what happened, and she just stared at me for a bit and went on to tell me that she's seen that thing too. Each time she's seen it, The thing was always next me or above me, and she described it exactly the way I see it. I never gave her a full description. The really freaky thing was that there was a time period of about a year where I was in Portland and she was still in Chicago, job hunting before the move, where she never saw it again. As soon as she moved back in with me, she started seeing it again. I could see if it was just me seeing these things while half asleep or in the dark, eyes playing tricks on me, but I'm a little more skeptical now that she's seen the same thing and always around me. I built a house in the country, brand new neighborhood that was all wooded previously. There were a number of plantations along the river about 5 miles down the road, but nothing really historic about this neighborhood. We had just moved into the house and we were unpacking. I walked past the dining room and saw a portly old woman who was wearing clothing from an older period. Maybe late 1800s? 3 seconds later she was gone. I chalked it up as stress related to moving and kept unpacking. About 45 minutes later my wife was in the kitchen and said that she was embarrassed to bring it up, but she had walked into the living room and saw a chubby old lady in clothes from the 1800s. I hadn't said a word about what I saw, as I was convinced that I was just seeing things. To this day I can't quite explain how we both saw the same thing within 30 minutes of another without telling one another before their sighting. Never had an experience prior or since. This actually happened to me last month. I was doing this yoga workshop in an old auditorium here in Mumbai. I decided to run there, and ended up massively overestimating the time I was required to be there. So I was at the auditorium at 6:30 a.m. for an 8 a.m. class. The building was open but the main auditorium was locked, so I decided to do some stretches on landing of the stairwell. It's a 6-story building and I was on the 4th floor. From where I was, I could see 2 flights of stairs in plain view. So I'm stretching when I suddenly hear footsteps coming down 1 flight of stairs. I look up and there's no body there. And in spite of the fact that I could see nothing, I could hear it so clearly that I could tell you which stair the sound of the steps was coming from. It sounded like heavy leather sandals, and there was still no one there. But for some reason, I didn't move. I just felt so tired. I was doing hamstring stretches, so I had my legs in whatever rendition of a split I could manage, and just the thought of getting up made me exhausted. The footsteps stopped on the stair right in front of me. Suddenly I felt this warmth around my neck, and before I knew it my neck was burning. I didn't feel choked or anything, just that the skin on my neck felt like 300 degrees. And that's when I made the motion to get up. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I just could not move quickly. I got up at an absolutely normal, almost lazy pace, and walked down to the 2nd floor where the bathrooms are, started to splash my neck with water from the faucet. I walked back out, and sat at the gate till everyone else from my workshop arrived. I later found out that in the night all the locks on the 2nd, 4th and 6th floor of the building sometimes rattle in unison. This will sound absolutely ridiculous, because it was, frankly, but I swear that it actually happened as described. Back when I was young, maybe the 5th or 6th grade, certainly one of the two, our class had been sent out into the athletics field behind the school for our gym period. We had to do a few laps of the track while stuff was being set up in the middle, and I, being at that point by no means athletic, and inclined towards contempt, decided to walk the laps rather than run them as had been requested. My friend and I walked together, shooting the shit, not really saying much. Our talk turned to the weather. It had been supposed to rain that day, but the sky was mostly blue with only a few patchy white clouds here and there. It was in the middle of the spring, the day was warm and sunny, and there was hardly any wind. Given that the promised rain hadn't come and kept us inside for gym, with the certainty of dodgeball as a result, much to be preferred to lap running, we started trash talking at the sky. Thought he was pretty big, but he didn't have the guts. Was going to rain, but now that we were out there he couldn't get up the nerve to do it, etc. It was at about this time that a small dark cloud appeared on the eastern horizon and began to make its way over towards us. This freaked us out in itself, but we redoubled our efforts. Shouted insults at it. Dared it. It settled right over the field just as my friend and I were at the end of the track as far away from the school as possible. That's when the hailstones started to fall. It was pretty awesome, but ultimately horrifying too. My grandmother passed away in April of '94 and my daughter was born on October 31st of the same year. I was pregnant when my grandmother died and living in her home while she was in a nursing home. She always used to tell me that when she died she would come back to haunt me. She had an awesome sense of humor and was said jokingly. While I was pregnant I had a nightmare, or so I thought, that I was alone in a white room giving birth to my baby and my grandmother was there and she took the baby and disappeared, so I was freaked out. A few days after my daughter was born I was lying in my bed and my daughter was in the bassinet next to the bed and I looked over and my grandmother was standing over the bassinet looking at the baby and singing a lullaby. Since that time, my grandmother has appeared to me a few times, but usually at times when I am in danger, like I was very close to getting in a car accident and she appeared next to my car and it was like she was keeping me from hitting the car next to me. I don't really believe in this stuff, but I think she may be my guardian angel. Also, my daughter has said things or done things over the years that only my grandmother knew or said. And she never met her. When I was about 11, my parents took me to their good friend's house out in the country for a get-together they were having. They had just built a new porch/sunroom type thing and had yet to make a doorway into it from the house, so you basically had to go out the front door and walk around the house to get to the new porch. This house is one of the oldest in MA and it is creepy as hell to begin with. As the night went on, all the adults were out on the porch and the kids inside playing. At one point I decide to go see what the adults are doing, so I go out the front door to make the trek to the porch. Once I'm on the far end of the house, some really weird voice calls out my name, so I start walking faster and I hear the same voice call my name again, so I freak out and run as fast as I can to the porch. Once in there, all the adults are accounted for. No one could have made it in as there was one door and I would have seen anyone go through. They were all a bit startled as I was pale as a ghost and freaking out. After this whole thing I just chalked it up to whatever and tried to avoid the house at all costs. Anyways, probably about 6 or 7 years later, our family friends that lived there decided to redo the downstairs bathroom. While tearing down the wallpaper, they found that there was what looked to be blood all over one of the walls. After a bit of research, they found out that many years ago a man escaped from a nearby mental home and blew his head off in the bathroom with a shotgun. I guess the owners at the time just wallpapered over blood stains and sold the place. Our family friends still own the place. All their kids have tons of stories about the house. They all moved out as soon as they could. I still try not to go there at all. When I was in high school, 2 friends and myself were messing around with STO points. I can't seem to find too much on Google about it, but it's basically a way to gather energy from your body and channel it. We were trying, unsuccessfully, to move an object off of a table with our minds, like I suppose you would with the Force. Yes, very silly. After many attempts, we just kinda stopped and sat there. A few seconds later, all 3 of us felt the most chilling cold breeze come over us. It was summer, windows were closed, it was not the AC. We all screamed and ran out of the room. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Also, my father told me this story of his high school boarding academy days back in the 60s. This was a strictly religious Christian academy, so the kids were naturally interested in the occult. One night, a guy placed a key somewhere in the Bible and recited some incantation. A few minutes later, all of the furniture in the room floated up and got pinned to the ceiling, as if gravity had reversed. Obviously everyone freaked the fuck out, so they called the deans and the on-campus pastor, who started praying and shouting for the devil to go away. After an hour or so of doing this, the furniture eventually came back down. I don't know whether or not to believe this, but my father said he witnessed it and he has no reason to lie about it. One year on the 4th of July, my dad was lighting fireworks in the yard. My mom, brother, dad, and dog were all down in the yard, and I was up on the deck coming off of our second story watching other fireworks on the horizon. The sun had gone down just far enough that the entire sky was an oranged lull. So, I look up a little higher and see a red light hovering in the sky. Now, this thing is miles and miles away, I can tell, so my first thought is, well, that's just a plane. But I didn't take my eyes off of it on the off chance that it wasn't. I was pretty young, though I still do this on occasion, specifically because of this event. Anyway, I'm staring at it for a good 20 to 30 seconds and the thing does not move. Like, at all. It's just hovering in the exact place. Now, the height and distance of the light pretty much eliminated the possibility that the light was simply on a direct vector with me, and thus only appeared to be not moving. No, it was very much stationary. I'm still staring straight at the thing when the thought crops into my mind. Maybe that's a UFO. Bam. Right after I'm done formulating the thought, the thing drops straight down, then sweeps back up and through the clouds. I didn't know at the time, since I locked on the light, but my brother had been watching from the yard at the same time, and he corroborates my story entirely. Once when I was even younger, I was having a nightmare, and a figure came to me as an angel. Whether it was an angel or my mind rationalizing it as an angel, I'll never know, though I'm more inclined to believe the former. Anyway, the angel appears in this nightmare and says to me, "Don't be afraid. It's only a dream." Instantly I wake up, have a whoa moment, then roll over and fall into the most serene sleep ever. A few years ago, I had a dream that my Sunday school teacher's stepdaughter, who was my age, died in a car crash. If that wasn't traumatizing enough, I wasn't even very close to the girl, so dreaming about her death was kinda freaky, That morning in Sunday school, my teacher informs us that she has miscarried. The child would have been the first girl's stepsister. I have out-of-body experiences a lot. I can never force it, and it usually happens when I lay down for a midday nap, where I'm sort of tired but not really. It's very fragile and I am completely aware of my body and what is happening the entire time, and I can never get much further than my front door. It feels sort of like I'm walking underwater, and everything is very hazy, but I'll see where my cat is sleeping or the time on a clock. It seems like I can manipulate physical objects during the experience, but when I go back to check on them, they've never actually moved. I've never seen spirits or a silver cord or anything like that. My best guess is that it's some sort of very vivid lucid dream combined with the psychological effects of familiar surroundings, since it only happens at home. But I don't think it's sleepwalking either, since as soon as something breaks my concentration, a noise or cat attack for example, I wake up wherever I was trying to sleep. Back when I was in junior high, 1997 to 1999, my dad and I went for a walk one late summer or early autumn evening. We were on the road behind our house when he stopped, pointed into the sky and said, "Look at that." Somehow, I was able to follow his finger to what he was pointing at. It looked like a normal star, just a bit brighter, but as I watched the light from it grew. The moon was not out at this time, so I can't say this for sure, but it seemed to get as bright as the moon is in the night. The object then dimmed to an intensity that was less than what it was when we noticed it, but it stayed visible. It then quickly shot off. I say shot off because it didn't look like it was falling, it looked like it was going at an upwards angle. My dad and I looked at each other. "What was that?" I asked him. "I have no idea," he told me. We watched the news, read the newspaper, and went on the internet to see if anyone in our area had also seen this. We never found any information. I guess it could have been light reflecting off of a satellite oddly, but I can't say for sure that's what it was. And here's something completely different. For a period in my life, the years 2004 and 2005, I had frequent dreams that later came true or that showed something to me that I didn't know existed/happened until I decided to search it out after the dream. This had happened to me before these years, and continues to happen every so often, but never as frequently or in such an intensity as it did in these 2 years. I'm not religious, and I think that psychics are full of crap. This belief was further hardened when I told a friend what was going on and that I thought I was going crazy, and in response she gave me some Sylvia Browne books to read, so I would like to think it was just my mind being super perceptive and picking up on the very smallest of details or noticing hidden patterns. I can't prove this is what was happening, but it makes more sense to me than the suggestions other people have provided me, but I'm somewhat bothered that it doesn't happen as much anymore. Is my mind wasting away? If so, why? First summer in the new house, built on some really crappy old ground that could have been farmland, once. Woke up early as sun was coming up, looked at foot of bed. There stands a child of about 7. Long hair, white shirt, suspenders, wool pants. Looks like a playground extra from Little House on the Prairie. I stare at him for a few minutes, and he just looks back harmlessly. I figure it's time to wake the fiancée. I move over and touch her infernal shoulder, and as she turns, I look away from the kid for a split second and then he's gone. Rats. I have seen the ghost of the man who ran the old brick factory where I work on weekends. He was injured in the plant and died soon thereafter in the early 1950s. Both times I was in the old factory at odd hours, something like 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., and saw him walking in his plaid shirt, leather hat, with a cup of coffee. Scared the holy living Judas out of me both times. All I could do was freeze and watch him disappear behind something, like a stack of pallets. But by far the worst, and I didn't actually see anything with my eyes. Driving to Seattle, just outside Spokane. There used to be a batch of old, abandoned farmhouses in the huge old trees to the right. I look over at one and study it, looking at the dark opening of an attic window. I am hit instantly, like with a shovel, with the image of a woman in that attic. She's crying, in a wedding dress, soaking wet, hands bound behind her back, sitting on the unfinished wooden floor. She is filled with fear and rage, shaking almost uncontrollably. She has been utterly betrayed. A man is slowly and loudly coming up the stairs, and he opens the door. He's stocky, powerful, dressed in tan coveralls. His face is blank. Her emotions fill me, and I know she's dead. He's thrown her in the well. It's so bad I almost have to pull over and stop the car. My GF is with me and she's like, "Whoa, what the?" And I try to explain to her what I'm seeing. She didn't think I was crazy in the least. I went to a boarding school for a couple of years that was in a castle, long story. Anyway, some of the dark and obscure corners were a little creepy. One night I was walking out of the basement at night, and I turned out the lights since I was the last one there. As I was leaving, I saw what appeared to be a visual distortion coming towards me. It looked like a vaguely person-sized blob of colors that was coming towards me from the sub-basement door. At first, I thought it was just some weird thing, but it appeared to be on a fixed path moving towards me at an accelerating rate. I still kind of thought it was some weird thing, but it scared the shit out of me, so I ran like help up the stairs until I found another person. I watched the stairs to see if anyone came up, which no one did. I had walked that same route more times than I can count in pitch black and never saw anything like it before or after. I assume it was something, and probably an thing, but it was too unusual for that to fully fit in my mind. A maid committed suicide there a long time before, so there had always been ghost stories, many of which involved the girl in the basement. And really, it probably is all bullshit, but that gut feeling of mortal danger isn't something you argue with. I grew up in an old southern house. A family had lived there for many generations before the last in the line, a family friend named Edward, sold it to our family. One day we were moving furniture in and out. Edward and I would open the screen door, carry something in, and the door would swing shut behind us. On the way out we'd open the door again, walk out to his truck to get more furniture, the door would swing shut behind us. This pattern went on for a while until we noticed we had to stop and open the door every time we were bringing something in. There was no wind or breeze, nothing to rationally explain why the door would be doing this, it had never done this before, and in the future it would only do this when Edward was around. Edward stopped, opened the door all the way and stood back. We all watched as the door slowly shut itself. Edward sighed and said, in his southern drawl, that's just my grandmama. She always did tell me to shut the damn door. There have been a few. I remember the first few years my family moved to the US, we were in a small apartment bordering some swampland. I distinctly remember waking up and hearing a remote control truck going down our hallway and repeatedly hitting the master bedroom door. This was at around 3 or 4 in the morning. The odd thing was that we had lost the remote control for it months ago and the thing had been in our room closet, my brother and I shared. My first 2 weeks at boarding school I remember waking up very late at night and hearing rattling, like someone was shaking my vitamins, coming from my desk. It was a desk/bunk bed mixed with bed over the desk. At first I thought I had left the balcony doors open and a strong wind was messing with the stuff. I glanced over to look, nope, both closed and locked. Next thought that hit was that my roommate, in a drunken stupor, was attempting to get or find something. Glance over at his bed, nope, has happily snoring away. It was at this point that I started to freak out a little. The door had been locked previously that night before we passed out and the balcony doors were closed and locked, etc. The rattling continued for about 20 minutes, stopping and starting the whole time. Later found out that a lot of the dorms and buildings were old TB hospitals. There were other times when I would be walking up the stairs and I would hear footsteps behind me and no one would be around. I am sure there were other things, but this was 6 to 7 years ago and those two are the only ones that stick out. I've had dozens of prophetic dreams over the years, although far less lately than I used to. They're always brief, no more than 10 seconds or so, usually of me talking to someone or watching something on the TV or playing something on the computer. Usually I don't recognize the details of the scene. Sometimes I realize at the time when I wake up that it was one of those dreams and I write it down, other times I just roll over and fall asleep again and I forget, or it gets jumbled up with another dream. Usually that's the extent of it until the deja vu happens in RL. As the first few seconds of reality start to match my dream, I get that familiar deja vu feeling, and I slowly remember my dream. By the time my recollection catches up with events, there's only a couple of seconds left. There's usually no chance for me to do anything to change the outcome or tell someone what's about to happen because it's usually mundane stuff. It's not like halfway through my dream a guy falls down the stairs, so when it happens in RL I can catch them. Lest anyone think this is normal non-spooky deja vu, and it's just my mind making me think I had dreamed it before when I hadn't, I have on few occasions written the dream down beforehand and accurately predicted what happened. Also, one time when the dream was about a classmate talking, I was able to catch up and interrupt him in the last few seconds and tell him exactly what he was about to say next, thus changing what I had seen. But like I said, it's always mundane everyday stuff. No dreams of watching the news and it's a terrorist attack or a stock market crash. I was about 22 when I saw an apparition, looking much like an angel, wings and all. I was sober, I was by my full senses, but I was emotionally traumatized. Whatever my brain registered at the time, I will still vouch for having seen it, as well as communicating with it, with all the optics, sonics, physics, biochemistry and such which always accompany a real occurrence. I cannot possibly explain this in rational terms, and thus don't like to talk about it. Also, I have had a near-death out-of-body experience which was as lucid as my experience of reality right now, just more intense, and which I later verified to correspond with actual events that took place at the time at different locations, and which has convinced me beyond any doubt that there is unimaginably much more to life than my experience of reality right now. Both these and other, similar experiences have taught me that, despite my best efforts to consistently be as rational as I possibly can, I do not always succeed. I can't. Mind you, this is also, partly, why I will never willingly partake in a polygraph test. The mind is open to interpreting reality in such a way that it becomes indistinguishable from fantasy/falsehood by design, optical illusion, anyone? And true truth is really unintelligible to us, as humans, with brains. The brain is essentially too lazy to comprehend the bigger picture, and believes to be real, or true, only that which it finds least effort to accomplish.